The prime goal of government is to protect the minority of the opulent from the majority. And in order to do that, you've got to fragment the majority so they really can't get together and do very much. And you have to concentrate power in the wealth of the nation.
Malice, and let that be your welcome for the next half hour. We just spent 40 minutes trying to get my guest on the phone. We finally have him, Shane O'Mara, who is the professor of experimental brain research at Trinity College in Dublin, across the pond, and author of Why Torture Doesn't Work. And I think the fact that we spent 40 minutes trying to connect this proves that torture does work. So let's go through what we just have to try. We tried getting you on a VMX call. We couldn't get your mic to work. We tried every mic setting. We went into your computer to double check. We tried every mic setting. It didn't work. We have you on the phone with our phone. We couldn't get the volumes to level up. So I'm going to speak in my best transatlantic accent newscaster tone because my understanding is my volume is a little low on your phone. So I want to make sure you can hear me clearly and coherently. How are you today, sir?
I'm good. Thank you very much.
Okay. So the big issue, torture has obviously been a very big issue here in the States. There was the CIA report with what has been going on at Gitmo. And I was on a podcast not that long ago, and the host was a conservative. And his whole point is, well, if you had someone and they knew 9/11 was about to happen and they're the only person who has that information, surely you would want to torture him. And my point was that's a very, very slippery slope, that once you're saying, well, in order to torture one person to save many, many lives, then, well, shouldn't you torture one person to save a kidnapped victim, and so on and so forth. You're coming at this from a completely different point of view. It's not necessarily the morality. It's that torture on a neuroscience level is not efficacious. Can you please explain that?
Yeah, so there's unfortunately quite a lot to say, so I'll try and keep it brief. The fundamental point here is that when you're using torture to get information from somebody, you're using that as an information gathering tool. So you're making a prediction about the imposition of a state, usually associated with pain, anxiety, stress, fear, those kinds of things, on the brain of the person that you want the information from. Now, where is that person's information? It's clearly only in one place, which is the memory banks of the brain of that person. So if you take the view that torture is efficacious for information gathering, you have to predict that you can starve a person, you can beat them, you can electrocute them, you can bring them to the point of death, and you can do that repeatedly in an effort to shake loose the information that you want without it contaminating in any way, shape or form the information that you're looking for. And we can go to the scientific literature and we can ask whether or not that's true. And what we see consistently across all of the stressor states that are used in torture is that torture affects in very malign ways the brain systems that support the recall of the information that you're looking for. And it does so in direct proportion to the intensity of the stressor that you're using and the duration that you're imposing it for. So sleep deprivation, sorry, go on.
No, so let's say what that means in practice. So let's suppose I have some information, combination to a lock, some plan that's going to be executed. What would happen to me if I'm sleep deprived and deprived of food in practical terms that you're referring to?
Yeah, so we know an awful lot actually as it stands about the effect of sleep deprivation on the brain, and we know a lot about what will happen when you combine that with caloric restriction, in other words, starvation. And the first thing to say is that of all of the tortures that can be imposed, sleep deprivation is probably the severest torture that can be imagined in terms of the immediate and enduring disruption it causes to the functions of the brain. And we know this from a whole host of studies that have been done on volunteers, that have been done with military personnel, that have been done with people who are performing under extreme circumstances. And what you see uniformly under sleep deprivation is the induction of psychosis-like states, hallucinations. You get things like slowed wound healing, and in particular where cognition is concerned, because what you want is the person to speak coherently, you see a rapid degradation of cognition in direct proportion to the length of time the person is sleep deprived. You can't get sense from somebody who has been sleep deprived. And note something, sleep deprivation takes 24, 48, 72, 96 hours to work. So these techniques, by their definition, are very, very slow techniques.
Right. So the argument always is there's some imminent attack, it's always this very much like an action movie, that there's a bomb about to go off, and unless I torture this person, that's interesting that you say that, because the torture that they always show in movies and so on and so forth is the infliction of extreme pain. Now, let me play devil's advocate for a moment. You just said sleep deprivation is the worst form of torture. And I'm sure people listening to this will say, hey, I've pulled all-nighters, I've had to work on term papers. Surely I would much rather stay up than have, something put under my fingernails or endure extreme pain. How can you say that that is worse?
Yeah, so we can say that very easily because there are numerous studies in people who have been tortured through sleep deprivation and who have had other tortures imposed upon them. So a simple case study is that of Menachem Begin, the former Prime Minister of Israel, who was sleep deprived by the NKVD in Soviet Russia during the 1920s. And he was very, very clear that he would rather endure any torture at all that the NKVD would impose upon him rather than endure what he called the White Nights. Solzhenitsyn says exactly the same. Arthur Koestler says exactly the same. And we know from studies that have been conducted with people who have been forcibly sleep deprived, one night isn't enough, as I've already said. You'll feel pretty lousy, but one night sleep will make up for what has happened to you. When you start to push it out to 2 nights and beyond, you're rendering people essentially non-functional. Sleep is an absolute essential for keeping our bodies and brains working normally.
I'll chime in with this, and this sounds like I'm being glib, and I'm not, because this is the closest I've had to what you're describing, and I'll validate what you're saying on a personal level. No.
No, I'm saying my daughter has just come into the room.
No, I'm kidding.
Can I get a little
yes, is the answer.
lunchbox?
Yes, please. I'm on the phone to America. Yes.
We make one and you can contain it.
This is so funny.
Yes.
No. I'm sure you saw that video of the guy doing an interview for
Yes,
South
I did.
Korea. Yeah. So
I gave warnings not to come in.
But
They don't work.
I don't care. I'm not trying to be facetious here. One time, this only happened once in my life, I had severe constipation, and for 24 hours, I couldn't sit comfortably. And at a certain point, I started having suicidal ideation. Not that I was literally going to commit self-harm, but my brain was like, I can't live like this any longer. It starts to break down and you start getting disordered thinking. So that's the closest approximation I could have. And that's after 24 hours. That's moderate abdominal discomfort. I'm sure it gets exponentially worse after 48, 72.
Yeah,
it's unconscionable.
The curves for this rise very, very steeply. The best way probably of thinking about this is if you look in the brains of experimental volunteers who've done 24 hours sleep deprivation, what you find is there is a buildup of a protein called beta amyloid. Beta amyloid is the protein that causes Alzheimer's disease. It's a pro-amnestic protein, and it starts to you need it for normal brain function, but it turns over every 24 hours, and you should get rid of it every 24 hours. Yes, you can. You can. Sorry, she's
please.
10 and she's baking. But it turns over, and you should remove this from the brain. It builds up in the brain areas that are responsible for memory. That alone is problematic. The best way probably to think about sleep deprivation on those kinds of scales is that it's the equivalent of a mild to moderate concussion in terms of the effects that it has on you. And as you know, somebody who is concussed has problems with short-term memory, they have problems with orientation in time and space, they may have problems recalling their own name transiently, they may not know where they are, all of those kinds of things. It's an extremely effective technique if you want to break somebody down psychologically. It's a very, very poor technique if you want to gather information from that person.
Right, because after a certain point, when your brain is not working and you're having disordered thinking, at that point it's just about what do I need to say to get you to let me sleep. There's not even a question of you can't even think at all. All your brain is thinking about, I can't even imagine after 72, I'm sure your brain is screaming at you, I have to go to sleep, and anything I do has to be a means toward that end. So just tell them what'll get them to shut up.
And that is the uniform testimony of torture victims, that they will sign whatever is put in front of them. And this is the problem with torture. It's an extremely useful device or practice if you want to extract a confession. But as an interrogator, what you're looking for is truth. What you want is to get at what it is that the person believes they know about X, Y, or Z. And these so-called, as Stalin called them, techniques of pressure, do not function for this particular purpose because they attack the fabric of the device that you're trying to extract the information from.
So we actually, this isn't just your opinion or mine. We have perhaps the person who is the greatest person to speak on torture in contemporary times, Lavrenti Beria. He was Stalin's chief torturer. He tortured who knows how many people personally, certainly thousands, if not tens of thousands, under his domain. He was a multiple murderer, rapist. To this day, in his dacha in Moscow, they're finding bodies buried in the soil. What he would do is he would bring in young women, and he answered to no one but Stalin, and he was Stalin's goon. He would bring in women to his dacha. He would rape them and tell them, if you don't sleep with me, then your family will be sent to the gulag, even though in many cases the family had not only been sent to the gulag, but had actually been killed. And his very famous quote is something to the effect of, if you give me the name, I'll give you the confession. And he would beat people until their eyes fell out, like literally that sort of level. And he had a quote after 1953, which I sent to you, which I found in Anne Applebaum's book. And he said, this man has firsthand experience on a level none of us, could ever dream. A person that's beaten will give the kind of confession that the interrogating agents want, will admit that he's an English or an American spy or whatever we want, but it will never be possible to know the truth this way. So this is someone who is speaking from multiple experiences. This isn't volunteers. These are people whose lives were ended by him and whose job was to get information from them. And he is saying this never works. Not sometimes, never.
And this is the testimony of history. And people don't often want to recognize this. The quote from Beria is brilliant. But equally, you can go back through the testimony of the ages and get multiple quotes of this type. The famous one, of course, is from Napoleon, who famously conquered almost all of Europe. And he described it as a barbarous practice, which would allow you to extract whatever confession you wanted from a person, but you would never know the truth of the situation. And he wanted torture to be outlawed. George Washington, the same. Abraham Lincoln, the same. The Army Field Manual from the USA from 1992, exactly the same. The testimony of the CIA in 1988 to congressional committees on the Kubark Manual, exactly the same. You will never know the truth, and what you're looking for is the truth. Remarkably, during the Cathar heresy in the 14th century in Europe, the Inquisition, of course, is famously identified with torture. But even during that heresy, in order to find out what was going on. There's a wonderful book by Armand Leroy from a few years ago, who describes the techniques the Inquisition used. And in order to understand what people were thinking, nobody was tortured. What they did instead was careful cross-referenced interviewing of everybody in all of the villages that were involved, so that they knew the pattern of communication between individuals. If they wanted to force a confession from somebody, of course they were tortured. But if they wanted to find out the truth of who was leading what, who was saying what about who knew what when, careful interviewing conducted on a repeated basis has always been found to be the superior method. And the Gestapo, of course, discovered this during the Second World War. Again, famously, the Hans-Joachim Scharf, the famous Gestapo interrogator, interrogated something like 500 Allied airmen over the course of 1943, 1944. Never once used torture with any of them. And his methodology is actually at the core of modern investigative interviewing, which is the use of oblique, non-judgmental questioning, active listening on the part of the person that you're speaking to, and carefully trying to understand what it is that they are trying to say, not trying to impose on them what you think, because of course what you think doesn't matter. It's what they think that matters, and that's what you want access to. And professional interrogators, and the great Mark Fallon, whom I'm sure you are aware of, is a fantastic example of this. He has conducted interviews under great strain, including over the USS Cole, and he and all of the other professional interrogators will say to you that the moment that you start to engage in coercion, your source shuts up, because of course they go into self-protective mode. All sorts of other things start to kick in, the kinds of things that I describe in my book. And these are all predictable on the basis of our fundamental biology.
Right, because as soon as force is involved, it almost, I'm not obviously a brain scientist, but that is when the animal part of the brain kicks in. That's when the adrenaline starts spiking.
Well, think about it like this. Humans are social animals. We have come to the great position of dominance we have on the planet because we've been able to engage in coalitions with each other. We share information with each other on a natural basis without even thinking about it. If you go and listen to people in the wild, about 40% of what people say to each other is personal disclosure. We like talking about ourselves, and some people are very annoying like that. Just won't shut up about themselves. But the skill of a good interrogator is tapping into that innate capacity. The contrary thing addresses exactly what you've said as well. Violations of the norms of social interaction change dramatically how we behave toward each other. So rather than engaging in normal, respectful conversation, once you step over that line, and you start to engage in assault, coercion, all of those kinds of things, that creates a demonos. You have a body that's under assault. Your first job is to stay alive. Your second job is to try and prevent what's happening to you, whatever way you can. So engaging in that kind of norm violation is a terrible thing to do.
And it's easy for people to kind of think about in terms, maybe not torture, but let's suppose there's two scenarios. I'm going out drinking with someone from a company I might work for, a competitor, as opposed to I'm on the stand and there's a lawyer cross-examining me. Which am I more likely to give information that I shouldn't? In the second case, I'm shutting down. I'm speaking very succinctly. No, yes, I'm keeping everything as close to my chest as possible. It's hardly torture, but I know this person is my adversary, and I'm going to do everything consciously and subconsciously to maintain keep my ideas close to my chest. In the first case, I'm dropping my guard. This guy's my friend. Like you said, they're social. It would be weird if I was just saying yes. No, I would want to share with him. There's this sense of reciprocity. One of the obvious questions I'm sure you get all the time is specifically regarding, we got this from chat room, specifically regarding 9/11. They claim that they got a lot of information through waterboarding people. Do you regard waterboarding as torture, and is that claim accurate?
So, there's two different things to say. First of all, waterboarding is clearly torture. There's no point pretending otherwise. It's been given a variety of different names over the years. If you go into the torture museums, which you find scattered, in particularly around Italy, you'll find waterboards and you'll find funnels and all sorts of devices for forcing people to confess to heresy 300-400 years ago. It certainly rises to the standard of torture in the sense that your breathing is impaired, your oropharynx fills up with water, so you're unable to breathe properly. You can drown in with as little fluid as is in the contents of a can of soda. So you don't need much in terms of the volume to bring you to death, or to feel like you're dying. It induces something called the diving reflex, which is this profound change in your body that drives you to want to seek sources of oxygen. We all experience that every morning. You wash your face in cold water, you get this kind of an effect. But it's being done to you on a repeated basis over which you have no control. You're lying in the wrong position to cough. So when your throat is filled up with water, as it will be, you can't cough the fluid free. Somebody has to strike you on the abdomen to help you clear the contents of your throat. Now, as to the specific question with regard to 9/11, of course we've all seen, or many of us will have seen, Zero Dark 30, and the kind of cinematic representation regarding that. Now, John McCain, who was buried last week, wrote a really strong letter, along with Dianne Feinstein, I think, to the makers of that movie regarding the distortions of fact. And to the extent that we know, and these are difficult things to be able to state with any certitude, it doesn't look to me, on my reading of the evidence, that any information that was gathered under waterboarding led to the eventual killing of Osama bin Laden. I can't say that with certainty, for the simple reason that all the documents haven't been released.
Right.
But what we can say, at least on the basis of what's in the Senate torture report, which consists principally of redacted documents, emails and things, forwards and backwards, between Washington and Guantanamo, is that most of the time, most of what they were getting was either zero or nothing worth talking about. There is a long piece in one of the memos describing how Abu Zubaydah was being waterboarded, and he goes into convulsions. You see bubbles rising from his open mouth. He engages in vomiting. But the last time he had been fed was some 12 hours previously, so the antiperistaltic wave reached all the way down to his duodenum, which is not what you would expect. It really should have been coming out, for want of a better phrase, the other end at that stage. So my strong sense is that no useful information was gathered, and the context that you have to put this in is one that people forget, which is that lots and lots of stuff is elicited when you torture somebody. Gibberish, truth, and some mixture of the two. And you have to chase down all the gibberish just as much as you have to chase down anything else. You're never going to know on the fly whether the person is lying to you or not. So if you look at Ali Soufan's book, you look at Mark Fallon's book, and many others, or you look at the International Committee of the Red Cross documents, what you see is repeated testimony from those who have been waterboarded that they made up stuff, and they made up stuff repeatedly just to get the torture to stop. And you have to devote investigative effort to that. Hence the famous plot regarding, I think, strikes by supposed African Americans in Wyoming, I believe, the whitest state in the USA, and a team went there to check this story out. And there's another story in Sufan's book about them weaponizing ducks to attack the White House. So people make stuff up, and they will make it up, and then you end up with this whole business of having to try and sort out the wheat from the chaff. And at the same time, while you're doing these things to these people, you're destroying the fabric of the structure that originally contained the information that you wanted.
Michael Malice here. Let me tell you about BetDSI.com. BetDSI.com has been in business for over 20 years paying winners. They're top rated on sportsbook review sites. It's got an easy-to-use mobile playing interface. You play, you win, you get paid. Simple. BetDSI.com has a great mobile app. You can use it from anywhere, and they offer live in-game wagering so you can make plays throughout the entire games and events. BetDSI offers odds on pretty much everything else, including all major sports, politics, reality TV. If you want to add a little excitement to the games you're watching, use BetDSI.com. Even if you don't like sports, you can have fun watching the upcoming NFL season and have the funnest workday of your life, Major League Baseball. Go to BetDSI.com and use promo code WELCOME100 for a 200% bonus on your initial deposit. That's a 200% bonus using WELCOME100 as your code. BetDSI.com. The novelist Ayn Rand, she had there was a very commonly ethics are judged by, well, what would happen if you're on a lifeboat? And her answer to that is get off the lifeboat is the first ethical question. You have to get off the lifeboat. People don't live on lifeboats. And when you're subject to torture, your brain, it's not even a conscious thing, I'm sure, is I need for this to stop. So even if I know just making up, oh yeah, me and Bin Laden and Marilyn Monroe shot JFK together, say what you need to say. I'm sure it's not even a conscious decision at that point. Just to get this to stop for 5 seconds, it's a complete, immediate psychological focus on what is happening. You're not thinking about lunch tomorrow. You're not thinking about tomorrow. You're thinking about totally animalistic in that moment. Is that not how the brain works?
Yeah, well, in essence, when you're oxygen restricted, when you're food deprived, when you're sleep deprived, that is exactly what your brain is trying to do. And we see this, for example, again, just pick a simple example. When you do experimental studies on people who are being subjected to what's known as full facial immersion. So in essence, they're having their faces put in water, so their breathing is restricted. Now they're holding their breath voluntarily, and you examine what happens in the brain. What happens is really, really remarkable. The bits of the brain that are involved in the control of intention, so all the stuff up here in the frontal lobes, the bits that are involved in recall, so that here in the temporal lobes, you see a shunt of activity away from those areas, and blood is restricted to the brainstem in here, which is the part that's responsible for the control of your breathing and cardiac cycle. And that's not surprising, because what the body is trying to do is protect its core functions. And when you're put into these kinds of situations, being forced to, or when somebody is forcing water into your nose and mouth, you, of course, are going to have behavioral panic. You're going to have to search for oxygen. And these are all reflexive behaviors. You don't have much control over them.
Yeah, and there's another parallel. So I think a lot of people think that for torture to be torture, it has to be pain-based. But if you think of an abusive relationship, for example, there's someone who's a violent abuser, who hits you or something like that. But then psychological abuse is so much more, people understand it's much more pernicious. The consequences are long-lasting. It's much harder to get out of something like that. At some point, if someone's hitting you, maybe you can leave the house, run away, call the cops. But if they're in your mind, that's something where there's no escape from. So I think it's important for people to understand that simply because, you're not, twisting someone's arm or, whatever, it's much more pernicious and much more destructive of the mind. And what you are destroying, like you said, is exactly where the information you need to have happen resides. And not only that, all these scenarios, like you said earlier, are often there's an imminent attack. But none of these scenarios that they're actually implemented have an imminent outcome. They're all very prolonged. So even the very premise of why...
I think the way to think about these is that these scenarios are empirically empty. They're scenarios that have been dreamt up by philosophers. They're ones that have been dreamt up by people who write movies or movie scripts. And they're they don't reflect anything that has happened in real life. And in fact, actually, I'm sure you know the actor Mel Gibson.
Yes.
There's a film of his I always recommend people should watch when they are considering torture. So this is the film is Payback, and Gibson is horrifically tortured at the end of this film with a hammer, and he what he does under torture is accept an enormous amount of pain in order to fool the people who are torturing them into thinking what he is about to say to them is true.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they believe him because of what they've done to him. And he, of course, delivers them into a bomb. And they get killed by this bomb. And again, the key point that I'm not trying to be glib here to say this, the key point here is that when you force information from somebody under these conditions of duress, you cannot assume that what they're saying to you in any way, shape or form corresponds to what's true about the world. Because you have to try and think about what it is that they're saying, because they want you to believe X, Y, or Z,
right.
And you don't know what actually they're trying to get you to do. So again, putting yourself in a position of kind of coercive authority over an individual where you're trying to extract information like this, it really is kind of a devil's bargain. You have this great sense of terrible power. It will corrupt you because the testimony of people that have engaged in torture is really awful. Generally, they suffer terribly from what they've done. And what you're doing is pointless because you're not getting information from these people that is of any use.
Yeah, and I mean, it must disturb you to see how maybe glib most people are. It's like, well, I mean, wouldn't you want to torture bin Laden? And yes, in a certain sense, I would want to visit great harm on him or any of these people who are beheading children or things like that. But that's a completely separate issue. I mean, the issue of punishment, I mean, what this does is kind of conflates are these people morally deserving of enormous punishment and harm, which is easy to say, but we also want to get that information, and the way to get the information, causing anyone harm, they will. Who would you rather give money to, the mugger or that con man who is selling you a bill of goods? It's clearly the con man, and when you're a torturing person, you're being the mugger. Whereas, like you said earlier, if you get that, kind of, well, we're not so bad, you're going to get not only more information, but more coherent information, and who is it easier to flip? Someone who you've befriended or someone who you've, poked out their eyes?
Oh, yeah. And in fact, you see, I think you've hit on something interesting, and the current U.S. president has hit on this as well. He famously said over waterboarding that, believe me, it works. And you know what? If it doesn't work, they deserve it for what they're doing. And it's this conflation of torture as punishment and torture for information extraction, which are the two kind of oscillations that people have here. Of course, we feel morally outraged by what mass murderers have done, but this is why we invented a legal system.
Right.
This is why we invented a judicial system, and this is why we are slowly getting to a position where we understand that extracting confessions under duress is not the way to get a reliable indicator of what has actually happened in the past. And there are so many examples of this. On this side of the world, some of your listeners may have heard of the Birmingham 6 or the Guildford 4.
Yes.
So these were innocents that were picked up by the security services in Britain for what were outrageous acts of murder in Birmingham and Guildford in the 1970s. They were Irish. They were in the wrong place at the wrong time. And they were sleep deprived. They had confessions beaten out of them over a period of several days, and they confessed to everything. And of course, history told us who actually committed those crimes subsequently, but those people were never convicted. The wrong people were. So I think one of the things we need to really think about hard in our legal system is not using confession-based evidence anymore. That we have to use what people say, treat it as trace evidence that is fragile, that can be easily contaminated, and it can be contaminated by the interactions that people have with others.
Yeah, over here. When I argue with this about conservatives, we have an organization here, the NRA. It's the National Rifle Association, and people on the left in America freely refer to them as a terrorist organization. So I tell my conservative friends, if you're advocating torture for terrorists, there are people right now who would call you a terrorist. I mean, this is not some kind of insane slippery slope. We've seen many cases where, warrantless knocks were used only for drug dealers, supposedly, and now it's being used very pervasively. And once this becomes introduced, any weapon that the state has, it's very hard to pull that weapon away or to say, well, it's not my problem. It's happening on an island over there. But another point I want to make is, let's talk about like the death penalty. I mean, obviously, there have been many cases where the death penalty is misapplied. Let's think about what that does to that executioner. I mean, think about if you're a soldier or a CIA operative in Gitmo and you're torturing someone, and then it turns out that they weren't, in fact, this horrible monster. They were just, a terrorist, but they never killed anyone. I can't imagine that this person would be comfortable for the rest of their life sleeping at night thinking, well, I just tortured someone who was a bad guy, but I mean, the things I did to him were far worse than things he'd actually done in real life.
And, you have the testimony of people like Eric Fair, Damien Corsetti, and a whole series of others who are clearly suffering as a result of what it is that they had done. Fair's book is an astonishing kind of tale of how he personally engaged in torture in Abu Ghraib, and the terrible remorse that he has been living with ever since. Corsetti is clearly a case of intense post-traumatic stress disorder, and he says that he has the cries inside his head continually, and these are the kinds of burdens that people live with as a result of having engaged in this kind of thing, and they're covered in moral shame because they were told that they were doing what they were doing for good ends, and let's remember that for a moment, that even the people who dreamt up these enhanced interrogation techniques were doing it because they were trying to protect lives. They want to save lives. The methods that they were using were just ridiculous. There's no scientific basis for them. But the people who actually had to engage in the torture are the ones who continue to pay the price, because they're the ones in the dark cellar rooms covered in the blood and vomit of the person that they've had to torture, and they've gotten nothing useful from them.
Michael Malice here. I want to tell you about HeshiSocks.com, HESHI socks.com. Here's what happened. They gave me a sample of these socks, and now I wear them all the time as my house socks. And you guys know how I care about my socks and all these other things. Here's what's good about them. So regular socks are thin and they're expensive, right? Dress socks and things like that. Then they wear out. And what makes Heshi socks better is they're cushioned, so it's like you're wearing pillows on your feet. I can attest to this. I sleep in them. Arch support, so they stay secure like an athletic sock. And the fabric is high-end Pima cotton, so it's very breathable, so they don't smell. But at the same time, your feet aren't sweating. They've got different styles. They got basic, they got fashion. So you can wear them with dress shoes, you can wear them with sneakers. If you go to HESHIsocks.com, Heshi Socks, highly recommend them. I wear them. Use promo code WELCOME30, you get 30% off. WELCOME30 for 30% off from HeshiSocks.com. So you spoke earlier, let's talk about how the brain works. You spoke earlier about humans being social animals. I can't imagine it's possible for any human being to make eye contact with another human being and on some level, and inflict great pain on them, unless you're a complete psychopath or sociopath, on some level, and not have it affect you psychologically. I don't see how that's even possible. Even if you know intellectually this person deserves it, let's suppose, on some animal level, that is going to, I mean, we hear, not even with vis-a-vis torture, which very few people have done, but with soldiers, when they're shooting someone who they think deserves to be shot, they're still very just shook up for life. This isn't something they come back and chat about and like, oh, haha, I shot this guy. No. This moves them profoundly. Is that not correct?
Generally it is, but armies and people, of course, who have engaged in torture are very good at figuring out techniques for distancing a person psychologically from what they've done. So ideally, you wear a mask you put a mask on them so you can't see them. So the famous case in Northern Ireland were of the hooded men who were tortured in Castlereagh police station, and they were forced to wear masks or hoods over their heads for periods of I don't know, certainly days to weeks. But that prevents you making a personal connection with the person. You don't look them in the eye. You can't see them. So the kind of distance that you need in order to engage in these kinds of behaviours is created. So I think that's kind of a trick that's always available, that if you can engage in some unit of psychological distancing so that the person that you're interacting with isn't a person or in some way is depersonalized, it becomes easier. Of course, that's true in the moment. In the weeks and months and years afterwards, it becomes quite different when it plays in your memory.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, people in the States have this opinion, which let's just take for the sake of argument it's true, that we're the kind of this moral high ground in the world. And Camus, who I'm sure you're familiar with, has this essay called Reflections on the Guillotine. And the point he makes about being against the death penalty, he goes, no murderer, no matter how depraved, is going to lock you in a cell for years and tell you at the end of 5 years, we're going to execute you. And at a certain point, if we are going, the Western world are going to claim the moral high ground and be in a position to look down on ISIS, which we certainly are clearly in a position to look down on them, once we start doing these things, doesn't it become this kind of arms race? That, well, just because we can call them enemy non-combatants, therefore we can do whatever we want to them and throw human rights out the window. It just seems like this is an escalation that at some point that's going to be used against us.
Well, I think if in a sense, it already has been used. There's a very important paper by Alberto Mora, who was in the U.S. Navy, where he looked at radicalization in the Islamic world, and what drove radicalization in many cases were the images from Bagram, from Abu Ghraib, and from Guantanamo. More locally, the conflict in Northern Ireland, which ran for 30 odd years.
Yeah.
Much of the radicalization that happened there was when people were arrested without cause, taken away and imprisoned under what was known as the internment regime, many of whom were tortured and then just took back out on the street when it was discovered that they were the wrong individuals. On the other hand, we need to be careful here. Even during the years of enhanced interrogation, there was great pushback within the U.S. Against it. Once the memos became available, when the evidence of even the memos' existence became available in 2005, that the program of enhanced interrogation was shut down. It only lasted, I think, 3 years in total. When the images became available from Abu Ghraib, the blowback from that was absolutely shocking. And the U.S. has a great tradition in especially in the NGOs, the Physicians for Human Rights, and all sorts of other individuals, but also in conservative philosophy. People forget this. Ronald Reagan signed the Convention Against Torture into U.S. law, and it took great acts of mental gymnastics and casuistry to bend the plain meaning of the law in the torture memos so that the U.S. itself was not seen to be violating international law. And John McCain, again, a standard bearer for conservative causes, but absolutely outraged and appalled by the use of torture. There are these other individuals around, there are these other organizations around, and I think, when you look, to the extent the only thing we can look at are the public documents, but when you look at the documents that are available, the CIA itself knows that this program was a disaster. It burned everybody that was associated with it. The court cases are going to continue forever. The evidence that was extracted under duress is useless. It just cannot be relied on. And Guantanamo cannot get a court case to start because the evidence is all contaminated right at the source. You don't know what you can believe and what you can't believe.
What if we have another question in the chat room? What inspired you to study this subject?
Very straightforward. I'm a neuroscientist, and one of the things I'm interested in is the effects of stress and depression on the brain. And I've been working on stress and depression for quite a number of years. And when I read the initial accounts of the torture techniques, I thought, this is insane.
Yeah.
These are the kinds of things that you would do if you wanted to induce post-traumatic stress disorder, if you wanted to induce major depressive disorder, and if you wanted to induce disorders of memory. It's not the kind of thing that you would do if you wanted to recover memories from somebody. And the techniques like heating, cooling, caloric restriction, sleep deprivation, all of these things uniformly degrade brain function, and they degrade it in the direction contrary to the direction that you want, which is to allow you to extract information from people. And on the other side, there's been a long tradition in psychology, particularly of being able to connect with individuals who are in a variety of conditions of extremis, people who are suicidal, who are self-harming, all of those kinds of things. And there was no attempt to think, how do we engage in kind of a, quote, clinical conversation with these individuals? How do we engage in active listening? Those kinds of things. So initially I wrote a paper just laying out some of the evidence about why, for example, sleep deprivation is bad for learning and memory. We know that without any shadow of a doubt. But I felt that after I'd written the paper nearly 10 years ago now, that there was more to say, there was more to do, and nobody had done it.
Right.
So somebody had to do it. So I found myself writing this book to put together the evidence in a really, really systematic way, because if you're going to say, near drowning is the royal road to information extraction, what's the evidence for that?
Right.
We can go and look at the literature and we can say, well, what are the effects? What do we know about the brain systems that are affected by drowning? If you say it's pain, again, we have a huge literature on chronic pain patients suffering from acute pain. We have a literature from injuries suffered in the course of combat. We have an experimental literature from people who are willing to be injected with capsaicin or who will willingly undergo electric shocks, and we can see what happens in the brain, and we can ask what is the interaction between imposing pain on the brain and asking somebody to recall information. And you have a limited bandwidth system. Your brain is really not able to attend to very many things simultaneously. And if you're attending to the desire to live, if you're trying to attenuate the effect of the terrible electric shocks that you're being subjected to, your ability to recall detailed information about what it was that you're doing, 4 years ago when you had a rapid conversation with somebody on a mountainside 3,000 miles away is really, really difficult. And we know from looking at the literature on the psychology of memory that the way you get that information out is actually quite different to imposing these kinds of stressor states.
I mean, it's very hard for any of us, obviously, to imagine what it's like to be tortured. So on some level, it kind of doesn't resonate. But let's think about it this way. If you got very, very, very drunk, you're going to have a very poor memory of what had happened the night before. That's not ambiguous. At the same time, no matter how drunk you get, you're not going to hallucinate, right? But when people are sleep deprived for 3 days, they're literally seeing things that's not there. So if your memory is unreliable after 12 drinks, like really drunk, the idea that it's going to be reliable when you're at the point where you're hallucinating, if you extrapolate it, and I'm sure it spikes much higher, it's going to be your brain's going to be like scrambled eggs at that point.
Well, you see, again, we know when you look at the psychiatric literature on the interaction between these hallucinatory states, because the literature does exist on this, and recall. We know that when you're in these kinds of conditions where you are hallucinating, or you're semi-hallucinating, or even not quite hallucinating, kind of having what might be called an endo-hallucination, your ability to engage in probed, directed, coherent recall of your own memory breaks down dramatically. But there are simpler examples that we can take. If you look at sleep deprivation in shift workers, a very, very simple example, people who work split shifts, what you see is that occupational group die more frequently on the journeys to work. Why? They're sleep deprived, they're making poor decisions, and they crash their cars.
Right.
So psychomotor retardation, or impairment as it's referred to, is really, really common. They make bad decisions. They'll jump a traffic light. They will do all sorts of things like this. And that's somebody who's had a couple of hours sleep, just not enough.
Right.
We know, again, if you go into hospitals and you look at doctors that have been working 48 hours in a row, you don't want to be treated by those doctors.
So right, exactly, yeah. Here's the other, right? So here's a question that I'm sure you get all the time. What the Navy SEALs apparently have to go through waterboarding and certainly similar torture, and they're saying, "Oh, it's fine." What's the difference between what we do to them and what we're doing at Gitmo?
So Malcolm Nance, whom you possibly know of, he's somebody who's engaged in lots of waterboarding, and it's well worth looking up some of his writings on the matter. You don't have a safe signal when you're being waterboarded. There's a great example of Christopher Hitchens being waterboarded online, which you can find, where he was waterboarded for Vanity Fair. He lasts 19 seconds, and then he drops he does the dead man drop, and he drops the metal bar that he was holding. So they cease the procedure straight away. There's a great difference between somebody who has this state imposed upon them voluntarily, where everybody there wants to save your life, you're not being pressured to say things that aren't true, and you have safety signals available to you, compared to somebody who's being waterboarded under these uncontrolled circumstances. And we know something terrible happened under those circumstances, because the tapes were destroyed. Wow. They were dismissed, or the quote on them was that they were, quote, ugly visuals. And I think the real problem is that if the American public had gotten to see what we've got the verbal description of, the outrage would have been something that nobody would have been able to live with. Hence, the tapes were destroyed.
And it's psychologically, I'm going to get a little bit crude, but one can imagine this scenario where you're in the bedroom and someone ties you up for sexual purposes, right? Where there's consent. But then what if someone kidnaps you and ties you up for sexual purposes? These scenarios are night and day. And obviously the second one...
but actually that's a very, very good contrast, because in the one case, you have control and you've given consent. And the experience can be terminated whenever you want.
Right. In
the other case, you have no control, you have not given consent, and the experience can never be terminated at your wish. You are under the control of somebody else.
And in the former case, no matter what happens, you're not going to be maimed or killed. The second case, your brain has no guarantee of that, and I'm sure that's
absolutely.
The highest panic
core
state.
To the definition of stress is this issue of control. How you perceive your circumstances and how you can control the outcomes. And if you perceive the circumstances as being ones that are going to be unpleasant, that are going to be noxious, aversive, all of those kinds of things, and you are unable to exert control, that's when stress really, really kicks in.
Let me ask you this one last question. What is it, do you think, that in this discussion that people get the most wrong about this issue?
I think that the thing that I think people get the most wrong is that torture is a really, really easy way to gather reliable information. When the evidence of history is to the contrary, and the evidence of neuroscience is again to the contrary, you can go and look through the archives, and what you will find is a marked absence of evidence for torture's efficacy. What you'll find is a marked presence of confession evidence. You'll find a marked presence of evidence for all sorts of crazy things, like witches existed,
right.
People were having sex with the devil, all sorts of nonsense. And you'll find voluminous evidence for things that can't be true. But what you don't find is lots and lots of information indicating that we tortured X, we got information Y, it was true. So the signal-to-noise ratio is astonishingly low, and the false positive rate is astonishingly high. So people forget the reality of what torture was used for and has been used for through the generations. A quite different purpose: to spread fear, to extract confessions, all of those kinds of things. But the royal road to gathering reliable information, no.
Yeah. Shane O'Mara, thank you so much for your time. I think this was it could not be a more important subject. And thank you for your patience. Author of Why Torture Doesn't Work. I'm Michael Malice. I will see you all next week. You are welcome.